Okay, what's going on here? What's happening here? Well, let's do the easy thing first. The easy thing is the last line. Jesus says the one who can accept this should accept it. So because he's talking about eunuchs, this that he's talking about is being unable to perform sexually, being unable to engage in sexual relations. In other words, celibacy. Those who can accept it should. So jot this down. Those who can accept celibacy, according to Jesus, should accept celibacy. Those who can accept it should. Now, Jesus calls this something that's been given to them. How have they been given it? He identifies 3 ways these people who are celibate, or in his words, eunuchs, how they've been given it. The first category of people who've been given this celibacy is they were born that way. Go ahead and jot that down. If you're single, if you're celibate, some of you may have been born that way. In Bible times, that means those people were born with a physical deformity of some kind. A physical deformity where maybe something happened, I don't know, but that's the way they were. Now, in our society today, there is a group of people who are physically or mentally or emotionally unable to be sexually involved in a biblical way. And they would say they were born that way. And they would say there are desires in my heart. Now, we don't know technically if it's a genetic thing or if it's an environmental thing. Scientists are still out on that. There's all kinds of research going in 2 different ways on that. But the bottom line is this. Jesus says some people are born without the ability or desire to be sexually active the way the Bible talks about, meaning in the context of a guy and a girl marriage. Some people are born that way, according to Jesus. Of course, they're born to be celibate, is what Jesus is saying. Now, we can talk about that some more. I know that may be socially insensitive, and so we need to talk about that some more, how that plays out in practical reality. I'm not going to do that today because I just don't have time. But the second category are people who are made that way. That means something happened societally or personally or practically to put them in the position where they are. Some of you are single today because of what people have done to you. Some of you are single today because the world doesn't think you are societally eligible. Those are things that human beings are doing to you to put you into that place of celibacy. But that's a gift, Jesus says. You're there. Thirdly, some have chosen it for the sake of God's kingdom. What does that mean? Some have chosen it for the sake of God's kingdom. Maybe it means they have chosen to focus their heart energies on the heart of God. Maybe they've chosen to focus their time energies on the people of God. Maybe they've chosen to focus their devotion on just a relationship with God that satisfies them. I don't exactly know. But Jesus says some people have chosen it. And throughout the centuries, great work has been done because of that. Mother Teresa chose celibacy so that she could work with her whole heart devoted to the lepers in India. And nuns and monks through the centuries have done this. They've committed themselves to celibacy so they could focus entirely their 100% everything they are being into God and His work. The reason you have a Bible you can read today is because for thousands of years there were monks who carefully translated and copied and maintained the text of the Bible that we have today. And if it weren't for those guys who had committed themselves to celibacy, you might not have access to this document today. One of the greatest missionaries who committed himself to celibacy was the Apostle Paul. And at one point in his life, he was on his travels, he was doing his missions work, and he got a letter from some people that he loved. They were at a church in this town called Corinth, and they wrote him a letter, and they asked him some questions about marriage and singleness. And Paul gets the letter, and he reads it. And he knows there's a whole lot of problems going on in this church. For one, there's a man in that church who's decided to marry and take his father's wife as his own wife. And it's just kind of messed up. And Paul has to write about that. And then there's other sexual immorality problems going on in the community. And there's other kinds of things going on in Corinth. And Paul knows he's got to write him a letter. But when he gets to chapter 7 in this letter, he says, now I'm going to start talking about the things you wrote me about. And the first thing you wrote me about is this issue of marriage and singleness. And so he jumps into that. And when he talks about this topic, he goes back to Jesus. And you can hear the words of Jesus in the writing of Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. So I invite you to turn there with me. 1 Corinthians 7. This is Paul's reflections on what Jesus just said. Beginning in verse 1. Paul says, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." Literally, the phrase means it's good for a man not to touch a woman. That's the literal translation. Some versions of the NIV translate that marry. Some versions of the Bible translate that sexual relations. But Paul says it's good. It's good to be celibate. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. In fact, the original Greek language behind that just literally says each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Paul says, because there's so much sexual immorality going on in this world around you, the guys need to have a woman that they're married to, and the women need to have a man that they're married to. So that the sexual immorality stays outside the marriage bubble, and inside the marriage bubble, we can be pure. Okay, then verse 3. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. The whole context is talking about sexuality. And then we get to this next verse. Paul says, I say this as a concession, not a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Okay, so first of all, Jesus says that singleness is equivalent to celibacy. Now, Paul is saying that sexuality is equivalent to marriage. Okay? So you got both of those pictures. Both of those pictures are going on. When Paul talks about marriage, the first thing he's talking about here in this passage is about the sexuality between a husband and a wife. But then he ends it by saying that I say this as a concession, not as a command. What's the concession? Look at the previous verse. They have a lack of self-control. So then when Paul says, I wish that all of you were as I am, he's saying, I wish you all had self-control. If you don't have self-control, you need to at least be married. If you do have self-control, then you're in a different category. He says, I wish you were all as I am, but each of you has your own gift. One more thing to notice about that. Paul uses this word gift. Jesus also used the word gift, but Paul uses a different word for gift. Paul uses a Greek word called charisma. And I don't mean someone who's really good looking and has a great voice and, they make everybody follow them and they're really tall. Charisma for Paul is the same word translated spiritual gifts in other parts of the Bible. Charisma means special gift from God, special grace from God. Paul says, some of you have the grace from God to be self-controlled. Some of you have the gift from God to be self-controlled. After all, Galatians 5:22, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Some of you have a gift of self-control. Some of you, it's been given to you, Paul would say. But it's not just that. Paul also sees it as somehow better. He says, I wish all of you were like this. Even though you have different gifts, I wish you were all like this. So what does Paul mean by that gift? Let's read just a little bit more, beginning in verse 25. Now, in verse 25, Paul is going to begin talking more about the people who are unmarried. And for the women who are unmarried, he calls them virgins, appropriately. And for the men who are unmarried, he just says unmarried. So verse 25, now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord. That means Jesus didn't give specific instructions on this. But because of what Jesus said, I can now, keep reading, I can give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, hang on there just a sec. Something's going on in Corinth that is a crisis. Maybe it's the immorality problem. Maybe it's persecution. Maybe people in Corinth are being killed because they're Christians. But that's the context. Paul says, because there's this crisis going on, we're now going to enter crisis mode, and crisis mode follows. Okay, because of the present crisis, I think that it's good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Don't seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Don't look for a wife. If you do marry, you've not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned, but those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. One of the troubles is if you're facing persecution and someone holds a gun to your wife's head and says, "Do you really believe in Jesus?" Now you have trouble. Do I deny my Lord, or do I watch my wife go? That's trouble. In a time of persecution and crisis, there's great trouble, and Paul says, I want to spare you from this. So there's a blank to write down. Singleness spares you many troubles. That's a gift, Paul would say. Keep reading. Verse 29, what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. New perspective. Now we're talking about brief time. Maybe the time is short. You're going to die soon, okay, because there's persecution. Maybe the time is short because Paul believes Jesus is coming back soon. Either way, the time is short. So now we're in brevity mode. Still crisis. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. Now, I know someone who read this verse where it says those who are married should live like they're not. And they applied this verse this way. They said, I'm married. God tells me I should live like I'm not. And so they separated. They didn't get a divorce, but they separated, lived in different households for a while because the one half of this household was committed to this verse. I should live like I'm not married. Completely ignoring the earlier parts of 1 Corinthians 7 where it says the husband and wife should fulfill their marital duty to each other. And they belong to each other, not to themselves. Missing the point that Paul is talking here about a crisis moment in the life of the 1 Corinthian church. But, verse 31 gives us the perspective. If you use the things of this world, that's okay, just don't be engrossed by them. In other words, if you're married, don't let your marriage take over your whole life. There are bigger things even than marriage. Look at the last line. For this world in its present form is passing away. You know, marriage only lasts on this earth. People last forever. Relationships might last forever. Marriages don't.